Welcome to Radical Personal Finance. For the last 3 months, my family and I have been living in Brazil. Now, I want you to take a moment and I want you to think about if you were going to move to Brazil or if you were going to visit Brazil, what city would you move to? What city would you live in? I've discovered by talking with people that most Americans, for example, are really not going to know all that many cities in Brazil. If I ask you to name some, I think you're probably going to list Rio, right? Rio de Janeiro. Might list Sao Paulo, right? That would be reasonable. You might have heard of some other cities. You might know that the capital of Brazil is Brasilia. But most Americans, anyway, would not know about the city that we chose to be in. However, if you were going to speak to many Brazilians and you were going to ask them a question such as, what is the best city to live in, or what is the most livable city in Brazil, many of them would respond with the name of a city called Florianopolis, Brazil. And that is specifically where my family and I have been living for the last 3 months. Now, we went there to have a baby, doing birth tourism. But while I was in Brazil, I became very interested in why every single person I spoke to who lived in Brazil would go on and on about how great Florianopolis was, or is. While I was in Brazil, I worked hard at learning Brazilian Portuguese. I made a great progress. I really enjoyed it. Got to a good, solid intermediate level, able to communicate fairly freely, good understanding. And I proved out one of my 3-month language projects. I read 1 million words in Portuguese. I really enjoyed it. So while I was there, I talked to every Uber driver that I spoke to about the city. And that gave me contact with dozens and dozens of people. Because Uber there was great. Didn't need a car. Didn't have to rent a car. Had to get a couple of Ubers anytime my family wanted to go anywhere. But it was great. And again and again and again and again and again, I wind up in a conversation with somebody and I say, oh, where are you from? They give me the name of some city that I didn't know and didn't recognize, but they're usually a gaucho or from Sao Paulo or something like that. And I say, why did you come to Brazil? Sorry, to Florianopolis. Why did you come to Florianopolis? And the answer that they gave was so profoundly simple and consistent. Before I give it to you, I want to ask you, what do you think it was? The answer is safety. Basically, every person that I met who had moved to Florianopolis from another place in Brazil, which I would say was easily 9 out of 10 people, that at least Uber drivers, would basically just tell me, yeah, Florianopolis is by far the best place to live in Brazil because it's safe. It's got a good economy, it's growing, and it's safe. And you could feel that. You could see that. I myself traveled quite a bit. I'm pretty scared of some of the cities in Brazil. If you talk to people and you hear about what happens in Rio and in Sao Paulo, the crime is intense. And of course, most of it is petty crime, but still, the crime is intense. And I don't enjoy being in places where I'm worried about my physical safety. But not once did I get concerned about my physical safety in Florianopolis. I didn't worry too much about my drop wallet. I didn't worry too much about using my cell phone on the street. I kind of just went where and when I wanted to. My kids were able to be fairly free. My wife was able to be fairly free. We just had a great time. Didn't worry about safety. And I thought about this and I thought, is this not the most basic, fundamental duty that a government has to its people, is to enforce safety, to force the elements of darkness back, to imprison the evildoers, to get them out of society so that honest people can go about their work. And look at the beauty that comes from a government doing its basic function well. And I talked to all the Uber drivers and I said, well, why doesn't it work other places? Or why does it work here? What's different? What's different about Florianopolis than Sao Paulo? What's different Like, what's working? And they told me stories about the corruption in Sao Paulo and in Rio and in other big cities that I don't remember the names of. They told me about how, well, you've got the police are owned by the gangs and just the corruption, nonstop corruption. And yet in Florianopolis, it's different. And I'm not informed enough to go into why. They told me why they think, but it's basically variations of the fundamentals. And yet, what a profound difference it makes to a city to do the fundamentals well. A government that is going to last doesn't need to provide some specialized festival on the 15th of May, and that is the key to its success. On the contrary, a government that is going to last needs to keep the streets safe, needs to get rid of the criminals, needs to enforce the law, needs to provide useful and effective services, and allow the people to go about their life. It's not some kind of fancy advanced thing. It's some fundamental basic thing. And in my experience, my background in the United States, or probably everywhere, we just profoundly complicate those things. But I've never in my life appreciated how fundamental it is until you don't have it, until you can clearly see here is one city that is far and away head and shoulders above other cities because of the fundamentals. Now, there's an interesting political point in there. If you think about politics, there's some interesting governmental points in there if you think about your own city. But for me, more than that, I reflected and said, what can I learn about this? I am not the mayor of a city, but I am the master of my destiny. And the lesson that I took away is, Joshua, you've got to remember the fundamentals. In our English-speaking culture, we have a time-worn, very effective parable that illustrates this. Back in the early 1960s, Vince Lombardi, who was then coach of an American football team called the Green Bay Packers, came to the first day of training camp for a new football season following what had been a catastrophic loss the previous year. As I understand it, I think that the Packers had lost to the Eagles. They had blown a lead in the fourth quarter of the NFL championship game. And so all of these players gather for training camp, and these are skilled, advanced players who come in expecting to basically pick up right where they had left off and start working on all the fancy new ways to fix what had gone wrong and win the championship in the new season. So they all come together for training camp. They sit down, and Vince Lombardi walks up to the front of the room, holds up a football, and says, "Gentlemen, this is a football." And he has everyone open up their playbooks, and they start on page 1, where they start working through the fundamentals: blocking, tackling, throwing, catching, all the most fundamental plays. Now, if you were a professional athlete who had reached the championship game the year before, that's not where you expect to begin. And yet, that's where Coach Lombardi began. And that team then went on to win the championship and then go on to win for many years based upon those fundamentals. In much of my life, I have been bored consistently by the fundamentals. You do the fundamentals, and then you decide, okay, I've done the fundamentals, I need to go on and do something else. And yet, we lose when we do that. We lose when we lose sight of the value of the basics. We need to start where Coach Lombardi started in our lives. If I'm coaching you financially, I should stand up in the front of the room and I say, "Gentlemen, this is $1. We talk about what you do with it, what matters with it. In your business, there's some version of that. I know there is in mine. In your marriage, there is some version of the fundamentals that you are probably ignoring. In your relationships with your friends, your parents, in your job, there are many, many versions of the fundamentals. And what happens is we forget about the value of those fundamentals. We forget about how These fundamentals themselves are transformative. If we try to apply a little bit of 80-20 thinking to this, I think the fundamentals can probably get us into the top 4% in just about any field. Now, I don't think they'll get us into the top 1%. Here's a comment from Justin Skycack, who I follow on X, and he makes this comment. He says, under-recognized fact of life, most competitions follow exponential distributions. And when you're on the tail of an exponential distribution, the difference between the 99th and 99.9th percentiles is bigger than the difference between the 50th and 90th percentiles. The higher up you climb the ladder of competition, the bigger the spread in your competition group. Now, when he talks about spread, he's not talking about the score, right? The difference between the 99th percentile of a marathon runner's score time and a 99.9th percentile marathon runner score time is not 50% different. It's not the same as the difference between the 50th and 90th percentile. He's talking about the amount of work that's needed to go from the low end to the high end of that group, and how much, talent you have to have, how much training you have to have, how much work you have to do. Right? So remember that in life, a lot of times, again, the difference between the 99th and the 99.9th percentiles is bigger than the difference between the 50th and the 90th percentiles. So the fundamentals aren't going to get you to the 99.9th percentiles, but they might get you into the 99th percentiles. And although I'm making up this number, they'll get you to the 96th percentile. By the way, the reason I'm making up the number is just that the top 20% always get 80% of the benefits, and the top 20% of the top 20%, which is the top 4%, get 80% of the 80% of the benefits. And that's just a consistent Pareto principle, a consistent 80-20 distribution that we find in basically every part of the world magically. It is consistent, it is true, it is something that we experience again and again all around the world. So this is something that exists in every area of society, and the fundamentals are probably all that's necessary for you to get to that top at least 96%, maybe even 99% in most fields. And yet, what do so many of us do? We do the fundamentals for a while, they start to make us successful, and we say, you know what? I need to go and do something else. I need to go and do something more interesting, more engaging, more intellectually stimulating, and we start to relax on the fundamentals. I'm not preaching at you. I'm preaching at me and letting you listen in. Just a little secret for you. The final thread I would like to pull is, why does this happen? Why is this the case? Well, at least for me, it comes down to the desire for novelty. I'm looking for some sense of novelty in my life, and doing the fundamentals again and again, year after year, is boring. We can listen to Kobe Bryant talk about how he became such a master of football. And when I listen to that, I think, man, that is boring. Basketball. Why would Kobe want to live that way? Doesn't he want to do something more interesting? I observed this when I was a financial advisor. I just found it boring to have the same conversation again and again and again and again. I didn't want to do it again and again and again and again. I thought, why can't I just record all this? And I'll just make a seminar. It'll have all my points in it. And then I'll say, hey, okay, if you have this question, then these are the answers for it. Just press play and listen to this 22-minute answer. And it's going to lay out everything you need to know. And then we can talk about something else. Why should I have to repeat myself again and again? And yet the people who were willing to just have those conversations again and again and again made more money than I did. I'm not entirely certain how to solve it, but I have some ideas, and I encourage you to think about this, because if you're listening to me, you're probably something like me in that you recognize, all right, yeah, the fundamentals are important, but truly, I'm not that interested in doing the fundamentals. I don't want to show up at day one of training camp after making it to the championships and then find myself having to talk about what blocking and tackling is. I'm interested in something else. So a few suggestions. Number one is, it's probably not necessarily always important that you do the fundamentals, but it is important that the fundamentals get done. So back to the example I opened with. The mayor of Florianopolis is not responsible to do the fundamentals of government on a daily basis. But he is responsible to make certain that the fundamentals of government are done. So he indeed may be out trying to talk to and wine and dine some fancy new business that's going to move to his town, or wine and dine some new sports team that's going to catch the headlines and all that. But he had better make certain that the chief of police is not corrupt. And if the chief of police is ever found to be corrupt, or if any police officer is ever found to be corrupt, he has to have a maniacal intensity to stop wining and dining the company that might move in and go and fix the police force. In life, most of us can probably get from the point that we have to do the fundamentals each and every day to the point where we can make sure that the fundamentals are done. And we should expect that. I didn't recognize that when I was younger. I thought, well, I just have to do this stuff, and that sounds really boring, so I'll quit. But in most of life, you do stuff until you don't have to do it anymore. That's one thing. Number two, we can find and develop systems, if we focus on it, that make the fundamentals interesting. Now, I'm no sports guy. I'm no sports expert in any way, but I am certain that intelligent coaches will find ways to incorporate the fundamentals into more advanced training. Where I do know this has to do with things like education. So a good math teacher is going to keep moving people forward in a novel way while making sure that they're practicing the fundamentals. I'm a big fan of a program called Math Academy that a listener turned me on to a couple years ago. In fact, Justin Skycack, whom I just quoted, he's one of the developers of Math Academy. And one of the things that amazed me when I started getting into the Math Academy curriculum was how great of a job they do of drilling the skills while advancing on to the next thing. So you're practicing your basic arithmetic functions. That's one thing. But let's say that you're practicing 2-digit by 2-digit multiplication. One of the things that Math Academy will do is once you've demonstrated that you know how to do 2-digit by 2-digit multiplication, they will instantly move you forward to working on percentages. Only it just so happens that in order to deal with all the percentages and the word problems, you have to do 2-digit by 2-digit multiplication to answer the percentage question. And as I've watched that and worked with my children through that, I've thought, this is how basically all of learning and all of work should be. How can I work on the fundamentals while then adding on some additional layer of skill? I think of it as the efficient frontier of deliberate practice, right? You're right out on the edge. How can we make sure that I'm always drilling every single day those basic skills, but I'm right out on the edge where it's interesting and where it's novel? And so, as a broadcaster, I try to remind myself of that certain thing. I try to say, okay, I've got to just go do another podcast, but I don't want to just show up at the podcast and do a goofy, just a boring show. I want to show up and say, what technique can I practice today while I do a podcast? And so I want to become a better storyteller. And so I'm practicing trying to introduce things with stories. And so that's why I started with my little story on Brazil. I'm trying to practice not holding back so much with personal information, but sharing more about my life like I used to do and didn't do for a long time, and then now I'm doing more of. And so I'm just thinking about, how am I doing something? And I think in most jobs we can find a way to engage our brain in something that's interesting to keep the fundamentals engaging. The third idea or basic idea that I have is that this is why it shows that it's necessary to have some form of your life. I'm going to use the word hobby, but I need to define that in a moment. But something in your life where you are engaged with something that is stimulating for you. Now, let me insert the word hobby here. A lot of times people would say, well, what's your hobby? And the idea behind that statement is, what's the thing that you like to do because you want to do it even though you're not forced to do it by anybody or any external factor? That's one definition that I would use of a hobby. That's what a hobby is. The problem with that for many years is I always thought that hobby meant that I needed to paint watercolors in the evening, or that I needed to be focused on braiding paracord. I needed some kind of like standard thing. And I never knew how to respond to that because I didn't have any conventional hobbies. So for years, people would say, what's your hobby? And I was flat-footed because I didn't have any conventional hobbies. I would define hobby as differently, though. I just define it as, what are you interested in at the moment? What are some things that you're learning about and engaged with and interested in? And if you ask me that question, then I can always give you an answer. Here are the ideas that I'm excited about. I've just been waiting for somebody to poke me and say, hey, Joshua, what have you been interested in about? And I'm going to give you some convoluted idea or concept and start arguing about, this is what I'm super excited about. And that's my hobby. My hobby is learning and thinking about things. And that's my hobby. It's kind of probably pretty lame compared to people who play tennis, but that's it for me. And so you might have something like that. Now, for you, if your tennis game is what allows you to do the fundamentals at work, knowing that you can go and you could practice your serve after work, cool, go for it. If your version of that is to say, well, how can I say this in Portuguese? Then cool, go for that. But we need to have some area of our life, some percentage of our life that is not dictated to us, where we are learning and where we're engaging and we're growing and getting better. And if we have that, then it can allow us to be more sanguine about working through the boring periods and doing the fundamentals when they are boring. One of the tweets that I keep in my wisdom files is by the business guru Alex Hormozy. And he says this: you can beat most people at anything if you just don't quit when it gets boring. Not hard, boring. That's where everyone else stops. You can beat most people at anything if you just don't quit when it gets boring. Not when it gets hard, but when it gets boring, because that's where everyone else stops. Focus on the fundamentals. You can make your city great. You can make your business great. You can make your marriage great if you focus on the fundamentals. If you don't know what you're doing right now, if you don't know what you are specifically working at, if your coach is not saying to you, here's the advanced technique that we're practicing, because that's how you know you're doing deliberate practice, then stop what you're doing, take out a sheet of paper and say, what are the basic fundamentals that are necessary for my job, for my marriage, for my writing? What are the fundamentals? Write out 3 or 4 of those things and focus on the fundamentals. Gentlemen, this is a football. That's something that we all need to hear each and every year.